Welcome back from what in the good old days would have been a break with coffee and cake. But anyway, you are in for a treat, because now we go to London, to Mark Leonard, the Director of the European Council of Foreign Relations. Welcome, Mark. What are the core trends we as Europeans and Danes should be aware of? Shoot.
Thank you so much, Luca. It's a real pleasure to be here with you on this important day. And it's been a real thrill working with you and with your colleagues at Tænketanken EUROPA on doing a number of different polls over the last couple of years. And just generally, that whole cooperation has been wonderful for ECFR. You set me a topic of talking about three big trends: COVID-19, Brexit, and Biden. And I'm going to try and talk about those things through the prism of three opinion polls that we have worked on together. And we'll probably spend about 3 minutes on each of those things. So I'll start with COVID-19. And we're now coming up to the first anniversary of the lockdowns when COVID-19 struck Europe and forced millions of people into internal exile. And I think the political consequences of that are still working their way through the system. But what we found for our polling is that they had a big implication for how people look at Europe and the whole European project, because the most profound feeling that people had was one of loneliness, not just a sort of individual level, but also people, I think, felt increasingly that their countries were being left alone to deal with this global pandemic. They couldn't rely on the United States of America. They couldn't rely on international institutions. And it led to a profound sense of helplessness. And we saw in that poll that we did a year ago that people's perceptions of the US, of the multilateral institutions, and of China had all been dramatically damaged by the crisis. But also, strangely, that there was a surge in desire for European cooperation to deal with the problems of COVID, not just the medical problems, but also the economic challenges which come on the back of the pandemic. And we were surprised to see this overwhelming demand for European action, which seemed paradoxically not to come from an appreciation of what the EU was doing, but rather from frustration that Europe hadn't done enough and that it had been too slow, too weak, and too absent from the crisis. And in a strange way, what we found was that European politics, which until then had often been split between opposing camps of nationalists and globalists, was that division was scrambled between the two. And many nationalists came to realize that sovereignty in the face of something like COVID or climate change or Trump or Xi Jinping was impossible at a national level. But at the same time, with those sorts of leaders in power, along with President Putin, it was very difficult to expect to have global solutions. And in that space came up a real desire to find European solutions. And our polling showed a lot of people wanted Europeans to come together to increase controls on Europe's external borders, to change our supply chain so that we were producing more medical supplies with the EU, even if it meant higher prices, and also to deliver European sovereignty in different areas. But it was a Europe of necessity rather than one of choice. I think people felt that the EU needed to strengthen their national sovereignty rather than wanting to weaken it. But that poll, I think, showed that there was a real desire for European action, which maybe got capitalized on by the leaders when they agreed the MFF and the Next Generation Europe recovery plan. That brings me to the sort of second theme, which is Brexit, which has obviously changed the power dynamics in Europe dramatically. A vacuum emerged, which different member states have been trying to fill. Emmanuel Macron has been energetically trying to pull Europe in a French direction. We've seen that the Visegrad countries have been pushing Europe in another direction. The Club Med countries have been trying to pull Europe away from its path of austerity. And another group have emerged, the so-called Frugal Four, during the budget negotiations, consisting of Austria and Denmark and Sweden and the Netherlands, later joined by Finland, which together make up almost a sixth of the EU's GDP. And we did a lot of work on trying to understand to what extent this group might fill some of the vacuum left by the UK, and how that group of frugal countries might be able to shape the future of Europe. And what we found on that was also quite interesting. I think Catharina might talk more about these things later, but we found that in many ways, even though this group has become a real power player, its leaders have maybe underestimated the support for Europe amongst their own populations, and maybe missed the trick in not playing a more proactive role in setting the European agenda, and instead adopting a much more defensive tone. And so what we saw from the poll was that, on the one hand, the moniker frugal was not really quite right, because only over 75% of the people in all of the frugal countries, so-called frugal countries, disagreed with the statement that Europe spent too much money, that the European Union spent too much money. And we also found that there was a lot of support for the benefits of the EU in all the so-called frugal countries. People valued the freedom to live and work in other countries, the benefits of the single market, as well as cooperation on security, justice, terrorism, and peace. So they didn't just see it as an economic project, but saw it as a wider political project. We did find that there are big concerns in the frugal countries about the future of Europe, and there were two in particular which we found quite disturbing. Firstly, that people were not against the European Union spending money, but they were worried about waste and corruption. And that was one of the top things that people were worried about. But the second issue was that many people in the so-called frugal countries feared that their country was losing influence in the post-Brexit Europe. And that led to a feeling that European integration was something that was being done to them rather than something which they were driving. And our suggestion is that it's not impossible to turn these sentiments round if you have a different mindset amongst the leaders of the so-called frugal countries, which leans into where the public is in those countries. And we sort of argued that rather than adopting the term frugal and trying to have an EU that's as small and cheap as possible, what these countries should do is come together and try and argue for reinventing the bloc in line with their country's priorities to make it more modern. So in other words, the frugal four should become the transformative five. And that means both trying to push Franco-German leadership out of the way and get involved in putting forward positive ideas rather than just blocking things. Secondly, making a really strong push on the rule of law and corruption issues. And thirdly, being visibly in the lead of trying to embrace these next generation challenges, whether it's digital innovation, green transformation, or security. And that brings me to the kind of final topic, which is Biden, which is something that we've just looked at through a big poll. And we've been looking at what prospects there are at rebuilding the transatlantic relationship at the moment. And what we found in our poll there was that by and large, Europeans in every country that we polled are very happy that Biden won. And they even believe that in his promise to re-engage internationally, but they do doubt America's capacity to come back to a position of global leadership. And we found majorities in all the member states think that the American system, political system, is broken. Many people, particularly in Germany, fear that they can't trust the American people not to vote for another Trump. We found that majorities of people in every country think that China will be more powerful than the United States within a decade. And finally, that only 1 in 10 people in countries like Germany and France think that the US security guarantee is existential for their country's future. And those sorts of lessons are, those sorts of findings are leading Europeans to draw quite radical policy conclusions about the future of Europe in the world. Firstly, large numbers, a majority in every country that we polled, thinks that Europeans should invest in their own defense rather than relying on America. Secondly, most surprisingly, even in some very Atlanticist countries like Germany and Denmark, people thought that they should look to their European neighbors rather than to Washington as the most important partner. So in most countries, Berlin emerged as the most important capital rather than Washington. And in Berlin, in Germany, they said Paris was the most important country. Thirdly, they want to be tougher with the US on economic issues rather than looking for an economic détente. And finally, and most shockingly, I think, from an American perspective, when they were asked how their countries should position themselves if there's a dispute between China and America and Russia and America, they wanted to stay neutral rather than taking America's side. What we could see through all of that is that in many ways the European moment is still there. A majority of Europeans seem to support the idea of a more sovereign and autonomous Europe. But there are some very sobering lessons in there, not just for people in Washington who I think have to come to terms with the fact that the US has lost a lot of its credibility during the Trump years, and that therefore, rather than trying to restore the transatlantic relationship and assuming that Europeans will align in a new Cold War with China, that you need to start rebuilding the case for transatlantic relationship based on interests rather than history and values, and modernize it and transform it rather than simply restoring it. But also on the European side, I think there are two worrying aspects that come out of the poll. Firstly is about the meaning of sovereignty and strategic autonomy. Some people seem to see this as a moment for Europe to become a pole itself in today's multipolar world. But the figures on neutrality suggest that many others seem to understand strategic autonomy more as a retirement from great power politics. But the sort of second and final lesson, which I think is quite sobering for Europeans, is this whole question about the implementation of these ideas. As I said earlier on, there was very little faith in the current institutions in our polling. People wanted Europe in spite of the current institutions and rather than because of them. And now, particularly following the vaccines situation, which I think Catharina is going to talk about more fully, there are these big questions about implementation. And Joe Biden recognized this in his speech to the Munich Security Conference when he said democracies must deliver. I think this is even more true for the European Union than it is for national governments. So if we think about Europe in a time of COVID-19, Brexit and Biden, there is a big opportunity for there to be a European moment. People are looking to Europe to deliver. But the danger with the vaccine situation is that if Europe does take the power that it needs and the responsibility that it needs to move towards sovereignty, it needs to make sure that these provisions are backed with the right kind of capacities and the right plans. And my fear is that if we don't move quite quickly into showing some success, not just from the vaccines policy, but from the wider recovery plan, we could end up wasting this European moment and seeing a bigger backlash later on because of a delivery deficit. We'll leave it there, and we'll let Catharina go much more deeply, not just into those things, but also to how Danes look at the situation based on your latest poll.
Thank you very much, Mark. Possible European moment. And I can also tell you that the Danish Prime Minister Frederiksen definitely confirmed when she was here a couple of hours ago that the Frugal Four Alliance is still very much alive and kicking. She didn't use the term transformative, so maybe you should work a bit on impact of ECFR. But now I move to Catharina Sørensen, the best possible vice director you could think of. You have conducted a poll also on the situation in Denmark. So what are the core results?
Tak, Lykke, to the best possible director you can wish for. And yes, we do like to use this occasion of our annual conference to take stock of Danish EU attitudes. And the poll I will present today was carried out just last week by Voxmeter. It's a representative online survey of 1,000 respondents. And I will also bring in some input from the surveys we've done with the ECFR and one input from the most recent EU-wide Eurobarometer survey. The details are on the slides, and you will be able to see the presentation afterwards. I hope it's already on your screens here. So I will start with the basics, and that's the question of membership of the EU and feeling benefit from membership. And the Danish replies that you will see on your screen look quite similar to the ones you would have seen last year, but they are really quite remarkable. Only 11% think membership of the EU is a bad thing, and there's more than 8 in 10 who think that Denmark benefits from the EU. So as we start on 2021, Danish EU support remains on the record high levels that emerged after the Brexit referendum in 2016. And this Brexit effect on public opinion towards greater support for the EU is not just a Danish phenomenon, we see it in many parts of Europe. So I think, to paraphrase Mark, if there's one crisis the EU does not have at the moment, it's a crisis of public opinion. But because this trend started with Brexit, I think it is still too early to say if these figures you see here somehow represent the new normal. I think Brexit, it's obviously changing the EU, but only slowly. And especially the Danes are among the Europeans who are the most regretful of Brexit having happened. Right now, as you can see on this question from our recent poll, there is really nothing to suggest that Brexit should somehow be inspiring Danish Eurosceptics to follow suit. Just look at the distribution of the replies. Only 16% to some extent think that Brexit will be a model for Denmark to follow. By far the most respondents position themselves in the other end of the scale. So if we turn to Danish reactions to the EU's handling of COVID-19, and obviously this study being carried out last week was done right in the middle of vaccine gate in the EU, of the big blame game going on. There were countless predictions that, and we also heard some of them today, that this is a thing that can really even erode public support for the union. But at least not yet, or at least in a small country, in a small member state like Denmark, we have not seen a big backlash from public opinion. We asked a question in the poll if people thought Denmark could have had more vaccines if we had not taken part in the EU's vaccine cooperation. I think Jakob Ellemann also referred to this question early on. Lots of people don't know. You can see the question here on the left, but there is an absolute majority who disagree with the proposition. And at the same time, if you look at the pie charts on the right, there is a solid backing for giving the EU more tools to handle pandemics, and there is a large appreciation that EU recovery plans can help Denmark have a speedier recovery. So I think this shows that in the eyes of many Danes, the EU is actually emerging fairly safe and sound from a very difficult year. But does that mean that Jakob Ellemann will have an easy ride if he does go ahead with his courageous idea or suggestion to address the Danish EU opt-outs? And that answer is no, not at all. I think maybe even there can be some comfort to be found in the fact that in a very fast-changing world, there is one thing that remains exactly the same. And that one thing is support for maintaining the Danish opt-outs. If last year there was a small momentum to address the defense opt-out, at least there was an even split between abolish the opt-out and maintain the opt-out, as you should be able to see on this slide, that momentum seems to have gone by now. There is a very large majority in favor of maintaining all 3 opt-outs. This year we only tested for this rather hard question wording. Do you want to maintain or abolish the opt-out? We did not have softer wordings on cooperating, participating in defense cooperation and so on. But I'm still a bit surprised when I saw these figures, especially on the defense opt-out, that opinions somehow have toughened up again. And the reason for being surprised is that there are so many other of our recent surveys who seem to suggest that there is growing support in Denmark for precisely the joint development of European defense capabilities. Just take a look at the graph that should now be on your screens. 66% of Danes say we can't rely, and I think Mark was referring to exactly this question before earlier, we cannot rely on the US to protect Europe. We have to look after our own defense capabilities. 2/3 of Danes agree to that statement. So maybe there is some paradox here. Anyways, if referenda are not on the table, let's take a look at some of the things that could be on the table in the closer future in a post-corona EU, such as EU taxes, health union, or this notion of strategic autonomy that we've heard today a couple of times, and that seems to pop up more and more often. In the slide I just showed earlier, there were about 2/3 of Danes who said the EU should have more tools to handle pandemics like COVID. But as you can see to the left on this slide, Danes stopped short of actually demanding an actual EU health policy. There's even a slight majority against that idea. On the other hand, you have 53% of the respondents who say they're ready to support EU legislation on green taxes on own resources, grønne afgifter. And in this respect, I think it's noteworthy to take a look at the pie chart on the right, because it shows that to many Danes, this green transition is not something that is automatically associated with a need for cooperation in the EU. So there are 45% who do think that the EU is necessary to reach the target of 70% CO2 reduction by 2030, but there is 1 in 3 who disagree with that statement. Moving on to the idea of strategic autonomy, we heard today from our Prime Minister that it's a top priority for Denmark to ensure and to get more vaccine production in Europe, and that together with 4 other EU colleagues, she sent a letter that's probably being discussed right now at the EU summit on how to secure such production in Europe. And our polls show strong support for greater European self-sufficiency. And also that this support may have increased rather dramatically just over recent months. The 2 questions that you have in front of you right now do not have exactly the same wording, but I think they suggest the same dynamic. So in April, the pie chart on the right that we did together with Mark and the ECFR, it asks in a question, among other things, what the EU should do after Corona. And one reply was that companies should produce more medical supplies in the EU, even if it means higher prices. And back then, we thought it was quite striking that 40% of Danes said that, yes, we should produce more in Europe, even if it means higher prices. But then in our new poll, we have 66% of Danes who say that, and in an even more stronger formulation, that European companies should bring back production in general from China, even if it means higher prices. So I think for a free-oriented nation like Denmark, this is a striking and high figure. And I think we need to consider what it could mean for the ambition that we just heard our business leader panel discuss on how to turn Europe into the world's global trading superpower. Because can we really turn inward and outward at the same time? If you read the letter that Mette Frederiksen and her 4 EU colleagues wrote ahead of today's EU summit, there was one line at the very end saying that we should ensure funding was also available for such efforts. And that ties in nicely with my final slide today, because we wanted to check in the survey if there's support among Danes for giving the EU the financial means it needs to deliver. The high don't know levels that I've listed right at the bottom of these charts shows that it's definitely not the favorite questions for our poor respondents when you ask budget questions. But I think we got a pretty good idea of the state of play. So about half of us Danes would readily say that the EU budget is much too big, but only 15% of us would select the correct reply, which also happens to be the lowest budget figure, that the EU budget takes up approximately 1% of member state GDP. So that adds one further perspective to the big budget challenge that the EU leaders always have to face. But these were my slides for today, so thank you, and I look forward to discussing also with Mark a bit further on this state of play.
Excellent. Do you have a comment, Mark, before we move on to the chat?
I think it's fascinating to see how Denmark in many ways has emerged as one of the most optimistic and positive about lots of aspects of Europe. And it was not something which one would necessarily have expected if we'd been talking about this sort of 10, 15 years ago. I remember the whole Maastricht story, and you set this opt-out craze, which has done a lot of damage in a lot of other countries as people have copied you. So it's funny that in almost all the polls that we look at now, Danes tend to have more confidence in the EU institutions and to be happier than almost any other countries we look at. And it'd be interesting to hear why you think that is, because it is very, very striking.
Good, excellent. We'll come back to that. But now we move to the chat. Eben, what questions can you
I actually have two questions. I have one from Mark Leonard and I have one from Catharina. And the one going to London is, what could be the possible geopolitical consequences of Europe's Green Deal, of Europe going green, so to speak? And for Catharina, do we know of any majority in any EU country that wants to leave the European Union at the moment?
Did you get the question about Green Deal, Mark?
Yes, hi. So we've just done a big report with the Bruegel think tank looking at the geopolitics of the Green Deal. And I think it could be massively important geopolitically, because what we're talking about is changing in a radical way 300 billion euros worth of annual spending on hydrocarbons and putting it into other sources. And that will basically have quite a transformative effect on global markets. And we look at how it could change that effect in four main ways. Firstly, because there are a lot of countries that sell a lot of hydrocarbons to the European Union countries, like Algeria, Libya, Russia, who will find big holes in their domestic economies as a result of this energy transition amongst Europeans. Secondly, if you have all of this spending on hydrocarbons going out of the market, it has an effect on global demand, which will depress prices even for people who don't sell hydrocarbons to Europeans. So countries like Saudi Arabia could be very dramatically affected by that. Thirdly, if we try to change the way that our economy works, there is a big danger of carbon leakage. In other words, of European manufacturers simply exporting carbon production to other parts of the world and as they move jobs overseas. So in order to stop that happening, the European Union has said that it wants to introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which would basically impose a tariff on imports into Europe from countries that do not have the same carbon standards that we have. And that, if it's done in the right way, could put Europe at the heart of a big new carbon club, which could have a real impact on driving up standards around the world. But if it's done in the wrong way, we'll immediately create enormous trade problems and possibly a trade war with our two most important economic partners, the US of A and China. So that is a really big deal. And then the fourth way it can have geopolitical consequences is if we shift away from hydrocarbons to renewable energy, particularly batteries, what we could find is that we're trading one set of dependencies on Russia, on other countries that export hydrocarbons for another one, because, for example, rare earths, there are a lot of minerals which we don't produce in Europe. And some of them are ones which China in particular is the main producer of. So if we don't think about how we get our supply chains into the right place, we could also find ourselves inadvertently storing up the ability to be blackmailed by other players. So all in all, if we do fundamentally change our economies, it is going to have enormous foreign policy implications. And if we don't think them through beforehand, we could both find that it's very difficult to implement the New Deal because there is such a big backlash from these other places, but also that we end up weakening our neighborhood and making it more insecure.
Excellent for pointing out those geopolitical consequences of the Green Deal. Catharina?
Well, yes, on the countries most likely to follow suit, after Brexit. But there is absolutely no sign that any country should be close to following Great Britain's example. I think the most Eurosceptic member states today are not necessarily the ones you would think. Like we hear about Orban and Hungary being skeptical on many of the new developments in the EU, and Poland as well. I think rather it's two founding member states, Italy and France, that actually look the more Eurosceptic in many of the polls today. But still, from that and to wish to leave the EU, I think there's a very long way. I think the polls suggest large majorities also in these countries who think membership is a good thing rather than membership is a bad thing. So there is no imminent Brexit effect across the EU. I think with Danish opinion, and Mark also just commented on that, it's for so many years been a very market-oriented approach, an economic approach, this great feeling of benefiting from membership and then wanting to keep a distance on everything that's not just market-related. But I think the reason why we have seen this shift across Europe after 2016 in support in many member states for membership has not just to do with Brexit, because in 2016 was also the election of Trump, and there were some series of terrorist attacks in Europe and other events happening that moved the outside world a bit closer to Europe. And I think in Denmark that's added a new security dimension to our thinking of Europe. And I think that's also what we can see in the recent support levels, that we don't just think of the EU as economics, but also in terms of security now. And that's a major shift. And I think we see that across Europe today.
Excellent. Mark, I know you're going to hate me for this. Brexit situation in Britain. Could you say a few words on that? Because I'm pretty sure that the Danish participants would like to hear any news, what's going on, what about the possible sort of negotiation taking place on the more foreign policy aspects of the Brexit situation, because as you know, Denmark and Britain have always had a very close relationship with regards to security policy. So please tell us. So
in many ways, Brexit has been overshadowed by COVID. The only place where it's very, very live at the moment is in Northern Ireland, with questions around the border issue and the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And that is going to be a very kind of challenging issue. There are a lot of people in Northern Ireland politics and in the Conservative Party who want to walk away from the Northern Ireland Protocol. There are also big movements in Scotland to have another referendum, using Brexit as one of the reasons to revisit the question of Scottish independence. What hasn't happened here is any strategic debate about British international orientation and any real desire from this government to think about remaking a security and defence relationship in the way that you're talking about. Look, it's very striking how myopic the government has been on those sorts of issues, to the extent that they have even refused to give the EU ambassador in London diplomatic status. And it is very interesting. In most other countries, people are thinking about whether there are ways of structuring the relationship between Europeans and Brits on different issues. In London, people are increasingly treating Europe as if the European Union wasn't there, and dealing directly with national capitals. And the government is thinking, as it tries to remake its role, about different forums like the D10 of democratic nations and the G7, as well as bilateral links with different countries. It's very depressing and I think short-sighted. And I think some of it is just to do with ideology, and the current fuss around Northern Ireland and around vaccines, I think, is also leading to reduced trust on both sides. So it will probably be a while before we're able to have this more strategic discussion, which I think will be really, really important, both to British security, but also, if it's got right, could be very, very useful in terms of delivering European strategic autonomy as well.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much, Mark. Do come over to Copenhagen at a certain stage again, because we also have new sort of episodes of Borgen sort of being produced. I know that is one of your favorite series. Also, thank you very much to Catharina. See you soon, Mark, and we'll try to put the various sort of polls on our website. Thank you very much. This way in the corona-like sort of situation. Bye-bye, Mark.